So as of late, a certain company called Oni with an S in the front has found themselves under a lot of fire from this, and well, there was this, and oh yeah, there was also that, but that's been getting me thinking. What do I think of them? Well, for the most part, I've always been more of a Nintendo guy. Recently, I've definitely been feeling some Switch fatigue and have been playing a lot more games on my PC or PlayStation. But like I said just a second ago, Sony's been catching a lot of flack, and some of that goes back to the beginning of the PS5 generation, with the console just not really having that many exclusive games. To finally get to the point though, my goal in this video is to look back on my experience with the PS5 to see whether or not I think it's as bad as some make it out to be. To start off, I guess I should just say that I've had my PS5 for about a year and a half now, and during that time from when I got it to now, the main thing that has continued to stand out to me is the quality of the hardware itself. The PS5 is obviously one of the most powerful gaming systems on the market, which is a really nice change for me after using my Switch as my main console for a while now. Don't get me wrong, the portability of the Switch is cool and all, and the PS5 doesn't even come close to having as many amazing exclusives as the Switch, but admittedly, it's nice to play third-party games that don't look like this. And speaking of exclusives, even though the console doesn't have many, the ones they do have really do show off what the console can do, but we'll get more into that later. But when I said the hardware was high quality, I didn't just mean the insides of the thing. All of the stuff on the outside is really nice as well. The console itself has a very simple but also very recognizable look to it. As someone who kind of misses when consoles used to have these much more instantly identifiable looks, I do think this is a slight step in the right direction. I mean, you show me the silhouette of the new Xbox compared to the silhouette of the PS5, you can instantly recognize the PS5, and I lied about the other one being an Xbox, that's just a rectangle. But then we get to one of my favorite parts of the console, the controller. The moment I first started using the DualSense, it easily became one of my favorite controllers ever made. It's got a ton of crazy stuff packed into it, on top of it just being super comfortable to hold. At some point they just started showing off too, like the back of the grips has a little texturing to it, but then when you look closer, that texturing has a bunch of really tiny PlayStation symbols, like I didn't even notice this for ages. You go back to comparing this to the Switch and the Pro Controller in comparison to the DualSense, it's just not even fair. Not that I don't like the Pro Controller, but the DualSense just has a way better feel to it and has a lot of features that are in the Pro Controller, like the gyro controls, plus way more. The main downside to all this is just that, yeah, it's a bit too expensive. It doesn't seem like they are trying to fix this problem either. In fact, it just seems like they are making it worse. The craziest thing to me still is just the fact that to get the console with a disc drive, you have to pay an extra $50. I'm no expert on this kind of stuff, but I just don't feel like a Blu-ray disc reader should add that much cost to a console. They're obviously just doing it because they know there are still people out there like me who will pay extra for a more inconvenient option. But hey, I like my plastic boxes. But even if I think the actual physical console itself is good, that isn't worth much if it doesn't have any good games to play, which as most of you probably know has been the biggest criticism of the console. So now I just kind of want to go through some of the games I've been playing on it to see if I think they are worth buying the console over. The first game I want to talk about is one that actually comes preloaded onto every PS5 console called Astro's Playroom. This game is more of a tech demo for the capabilities of the PS5 more than anything else, but it's also one of the best games on the system, so take that for what you will. Man, this game just has no right to be as good and as fun as it is. I feel like just describing this game doesn't really do it justice, because on paper it sounds like a pretty typical little 3D platformer, but it's all the little details that add together to make this such a fun little experience. The whole game is supposed to take place inside of your PS5 with all of the levels representing the different components inside of it. So much of the world is made up of either tech parts or random pieces of PlayStation history. All of the collectibles in the game are also just random PlayStation consoles, controllers, and weird accessories. You can tell that the developers of the game actually care about the history of this brand, which is nice since the rest of the company seems to not. On top of all this, the game itself is just fun. The platforming is simple but good, with the occasional gimmick section thrown in to show off something the controller can do. If I have anything that I don't like about the game, it's probably some of these sections, since they can get a little too gimmicky, but they also don't last that long, so it's not a big deal. Another thing I really like about this game is just how well it uses the DualSense controller. Like, truly, no game has used this controller better than this one, aside from the direct follow-up to this game. You can feel every single footstep your character makes, and it changes depending on what you're walking on, and then it starts raining, and you can feel that too. It almost makes the other game's use of this controller kind of disappointing because it set such a high standard that no one else really reached. The game is pretty short, but then again, it's also free. So yeah, what did you expect? Another game that was available at the launch of the console was Spider-Man Miles Morales, which actually came with a remaster of the first game, depending on which version you got. This is one of those games that I remember being kind of controversial, with people calling it a DLC that was released as a standalone game. I don't really agree with this perspective at all, but I can kind of see where people are coming from. It's the same map, and the gameplay is fairly similar to the first, but I also think the game has enough of its own ideas and content to justify it being its own thing. The swinging got a bit of an improvement with a better trick system and stuff, and then the combat is pretty different aside from your basic attacks. While the first Spider-Man game put a lot of focus on gadgets, this game instead puts a lot of focus on Miles' abilities like his cool electric powers and his ability to turn invisible. These two changes to the moveset encourage you to be a lot more aggressive than in the first game. In that one, you are encouraged to use your gadgets to do a lot of the work for you, with most of them being able to take out enemies very quickly by pinning them to walls or other surfaces, while in this game, you just run up and punch them with your electricity powers. The ability to turn invisible also greatly changes how you approach stealth sections, since even if the enemies see you, you can go hide for a while and get them off your back. At the end of the day, none of these changes make this game that different from the first, but to me that's fine, since the only reason I played this game was because I liked the first one. The main problem for me with this game is just that the story is a huge downgrade from the last game, but it's not terrible and works fine enough. But like I said earlier, if you got the Ultimate Edition of this game, you just straight up got a remastered version of the original game with all of the DLC included, which is pretty cool. There's really nothing different about it, except the fact that I'm sure it runs better, and they took Spider-Man's face off and put on a new one. God of War Ragnarok was a pretty big deal since it was a sequel to the 2018 God of War, which was a very well-received game. I actually got Ragnarok in a bundle with my PS5, so this and Astro's Playroom were my two big games I had on the console for a bit there. Those two really go well together, don't they? Now, I'm going to be honest with you guys here, I still have not beaten this game yet. It's good, no doubt, and I have quite a bit of time put into it, but I don't know, it just doesn't really grab me like other games do. The story is easily the highlight, and the main reason I ever come back to this game is because I'm genuinely interested in what's going on here. The problem is that I just don't find the gameplay that interesting. Combat is mostly what you will be doing in this game, and it is fun to an extent, but after 30 hours of it, I just started to get a little tired of it all. It's satisfying enough for me to have fun while I'm playing it, but not enough for me to be all that interested in coming back or doing any of the side stuff. In the game, you also just have all these different stats that depend on your level, the options you choose in the skill tree, and the bajillion different pieces of equipment you can put on, and at the end of the day, the game still plays exactly the same no matter what you upgrade or equip. Look, I get it. Upgrading and making new equipment, unlocking new abilities, that can all be really, really fun sometimes. But in this game, and I guess the game that came before it as well, there's just way too much, and it all starts to kind of feel like a chore, because I know deep down, whatever option I pick, nothing is really going to change. But after playing the game a little more again for this video, I do find the combat fun and enjoyable despite some of my issues with it. The different weapon options and other playable characters do a decent job of mixing things up, which is nice, and I can't deny that the combat is very satisfying, even if it does get a little bland after a while, and it does kind of make it all worthwhile when you get to those cool story moments. Overall, this is definitely a really good game that I would recommend if you have a PlayStation, or I guess a PC now too, that's cool. But I definitely don't think it's perfect and could use some improvement if they are planning on making any more of these games. So out of all three of the games we have talked about so far, a little interesting fact about them is that the only PS5 exclusive was the tech demo. Sure, these games are fun and great additions to your library if you have a PS5, but you could play both God of War Ragnarok and Spider-Man Miles Morales on PS4. So for our next game, I thought we could take a look at one of the biggest PS5 exclusives at the moment, Spider-Man 2. Now I know there are some other PS5 exclusives that came out before this one, like Demon Souls and Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, but I haven't gotten around to playing those, so I don't got much to say about them. So Spider-Man 2 was easily one of my most anticipated games for a while because the first Spider-Man game is genuinely one of my favorite games ever made. It's not perfect and has a lot of problems, but something about it has always just resonated with me. So when it came time for the sequel, I was there day one and pretty much spent my entire weekend marathoning it and really enjoyed it. But now that it's been over a year since it came out, I guess I should finally take a look back at it and see if my thoughts still line up with that perspective. So to start off, I just want to say that the gameplay in this game is very, very satisfying. The swinging feels better than it has in any other game, and the combat, even though I have one personal gripe against it, is super good. One of the biggest additions to the swinging in this game is the new ability to use the web wings, which allow you to glide through the air or catch these wind tunnels that practically just let you fly. I have seen the opinion that these sort of discourage you from using the swinging as much, but I don't really feel that way, as I felt I mainly just used the wings as a way to get a little extra distance out of my swings rather than a full-on replacement. But when you use your wings, swinging, and the little air abilities you can do all together, you can reach some insane speeds the first two games couldn't even dream of. We also have the combat, which I would say in general is more similar to the combat in Miles Morales rather than the first game. Like Miles Morales, the combat in this game is far more focused on the character's special abilities, with the amount of gadgets you have access to being very limited. I understand why they did this when you're playing as Miles or Peter with the symbiote abilities, but when you're just playing as normal Spider-Man, I really would have liked it if they had brought some more of the gadgets back. The tripwire and impact web not being here made me very sad. But putting that aside, the abilities in this game are very fun to use, especially the symbiote ones where you're just throwing people around and doing all sorts of crazy stuff. I do kind of miss some of the more stealth-focused sections from the other games. I mean, like, you can do stealth in this game, but rarely is it ever encouraged, and it would have been nice to see some more of it. I think the main thing people have a problem with in this game is the story, and while, yeah, it definitely has a lot of problems, I think it does a fine enough job of at least being engaging and getting you to a bunch of cool fights and scenarios. It's not a perfect game, and there are some things I definitely prefer from the first one, but I still find myself really enjoying this game. The next game I want to mention is easily one of my favorite games to release on the PS5 and just one of my favorite games to release in like the last decade. Astrobot is the game in question, and during this time of big gaming companies like PlayStation seeming to lose their way in many aspects, Astrobot is just that little beacon of hope that there are still some people out there who care. Despite this game being so baked into the PlayStation brand with all of the references to different PlayStation characters and hardware, this game feels so much like a big budget Nintendo game, and I mean that in the best way possible. I would genuinely rank this game up there with the 3D Mario games because it's just that good. This game takes the general gameplay from Astro's Playroom, which was already great, and just expands upon it by adding tons of new levels and gimmicks. Just like that game, Astrobot does a really good job of showcasing both what the PlayStation 5 and the DualSense can do. There are so many times in this game where you're just thrown into a big pile of tiny objects that all have their own individual physics, just because the game wants to let you know that they can do that. Stuff like that has easily made this one of the most satisfying games to play, because every single level and every single new gimmick they add has been fine-tuned to be as fun and feel as good as it possibly can. I feel that giving feedback and making the player actually feel the things they are doing, either through fancy controller tricks or just good sound design, is easily one of the most overlooked aspects of video games, even in games that I love, so seeing this game actually trying in that department and completely nailing it makes me so happy. Then, on top of all that, the game is just a very well-designed platformer, with each level being both fun and unique in some way compared to all of the others. This game isn't super long, it took me about 15 hours to 100%, but I saw so much more creativity in that 15 hours than I have in other games that are like 60 hours. Then there's the levels that are based on other games like Ape Escape or God of War, which at first might just seem like big advertisements for other games, but are actually really fun levels that use the game it's based on to introduce fun gimmicks that change up the way the game is played. Like, I'm not a big Uncharted guy, in fact, I've never played any of the games, but the Uncharted level in this game was easily one of my favorites because it uses the gunplay and the big action set pieces from those games and translates them extremely well into a fun platforming level. If you enjoy platformers or are looking to find a good one to play, I would easily recommend this game in a heartbeat. I absolutely love it. Chances are, if you are buying this console, you're not just going to be getting PlayStation exclusives on it. For me, I have other ways to play games like my PC, but I tend to prefer the console experience, so I've been getting plenty of third-party games on mine. Chances are, if you've seen me make a video on a more modern game that isn't a Nintendo game, I played it on here. Obviously, the PS5 having games that aren't exclusive to it isn't really a huge selling point, but it is just nice to have a console that you know can run the games without as much hassle or setup as a PC. So I guess now after talking about all of this, the question is, do I recommend the PS5 or think that it's a worthwhile console to have? I would say that overall I do, but it also kind of depends on a few factors. Like, if you're not interested in any of the PlayStation exclusive games and already have a way of playing games on another device, then yeah, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for you to get this. But even if you are interested in PlayStation games, that doesn't mean you should necessarily get it still, because most of these games are on or coming to PC, so if you have a strong enough one of those, you may want to stick with that. I think the main reason I would recommend getting this console is if you're just a console person like me and have games you want to play on here, or you just don't have anything else. Obviously, there are tons of things that Sony could have done way better this generation, and they could also just clean up their act a little in general, but overall, I do enjoy my PS5 and would say it's a worthwhile purchase if it's the kind of thing that's up your alley. But we're not quite done yet, because now we have the PSVR 2 bonus round. Recently, I got the PSVR 2 on sale for Black Friday and have been using it a decent amount, so I thought it would be fun to include it alongside the rest of this video. As far as the hardware itself goes, the headset and two controllers that come with it definitely keep up with the standard set by PS5 hardware. Everything feels quality, comfortable, and well made, which for VR is very important. This is actually the first home VR headset I've ever owned. I've used VR before, but never for very long, so this was my first real in-depth VR experience. One of the coolest features that this headset has is definitely the eye tracking. When I booted this thing up for the first time and it had me navigating menus based on exactly where my eyeballs were looking, I was very impressed. But just like the console, this headset ain't worth much if there's nothing to do on it. And much like that main console, there aren't a ton of exclusive games for it, or in this case, just games in general for it. The library isn't super huge here. Since I only just got it, I only have like 2 games at the time of writing this script, and I don't have a whole lot to say about them. The game that came bundled with it was Horizon VR Call of the Mountain. Besides this game, I have absolutely no experience with this series, so this game was sort of my introduction. A majority of this game is spent climbing up cliffs and other things, which may sound kinda boring, but the game makes you get very involved with it. To play this game, you're going to have to reach your arms up really high and probably look like an absolute idiot while you're playing. You also have all sorts of weapons and gadgets you can use along the way, which are admittedly pretty fun to use. The ones that have you throwing them are easily the most fun, because something about playing a VR game just makes you want to hurl random items as far as you possibly can. As someone who hasn't played much VR in the past, I will say that it's pretty cool to have a game that gets you this physically involved with it. With how accurate all the motion tracking technology has gotten, it's pretty cool to see how accurately the game tracks what you're doing. There are also these big boss fights in the game, which are relatively simple, but I mean, hey, shooting a giant robot dinosaur with a bow and arrow is pretty cool, so I can't complain. The main problem I had with this game at first was I was getting pretty motion sick playing, and that is not a common thing for me. I can ride those like 40 theater theme park rides all day, so if you're someone who does get motion sick this easily, I could imagine this causing some problems. The fix I found that worked for me is just pointing a fan at yourself. Don't know the science behind why that works, but it does. Another game I got pretty early on was Gran Turismo 7. Now, technically this is a normal PS5 game as well, but I got it specifically because I wanted to play it in VR, so whatever, we're putting it in this part of the video. I'm not usually too into the simulation racing games. I've always been more into the arcadey Mario Kart style racing games, but so far from what I've played of Gran Turismo 7, I've really enjoyed it. Driving requires you to drive like you actually would in real life. You can't just hold down the gas. That obviously makes sense since that is the point of the game, but it did take me some time to get used to since I haven't played a game like this before. VR really does add a whole other level to it though. All of the cars' interiors are fully modeled and look amazing, and you can look through the mirrors to see behind you just like you would in real life. I don't think VR is required to enjoy this game, but to me it adds a lot to the experience. Now I need to try it with one of those steering wheels you can get. That's probably pretty fun. Now, on the topic of whether I would recommend buying the PSVR 2, I don't really know. I'm not that knowledgeable on VR stuff, and I also got this thing on sale while also splitting the cost with someone else, so I don't think I'm the greatest judge on the value of this thing or how it stacks up against the competition. I've enjoyed it so far, though. Okay, that's all I got. This video ended up being kind of long since it was just an excuse to talk about Astrobot.